Hi everyone, and welcome to the first topic for the semester. Today we're going to be discussing Adam Smith's classical political economy. So Adam Smith is one of the foundational figures in political economy and economics. One of the most important central figures that we study. And today we're going to look at the key components of Smith's theory of political economy. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the book, The Wealth of Nations. And I'm going to present a quick summary of some of the key points of Smith's theory, which he argued in this book. So at the moment, I'm not going to get into any criticisms of Smith or his theory. We'll get into those later when we study different perspectives that have disagreed with Smith. For now, we're just going to introduce Smith's theory as he presented it and see how his theory works. So to give you some background on Adam Smith, he was born in Scotland in the early 18th century, 1723, majored in social philosophy at Glasgow University, and he was successful enough as a student that he ended up getting a scholarship to Oxford. However, he hated Oxford and was unimpressed with its intellectual environment. In particular, he criticized the teaching abilities of his professors at Oxford. And this was one of the personal experiences that he had that led him to develop his theory in the way that he did. So he theorized that the reason the Oxford teachers were not so good is because they got state subsidies from the British Crown. And this was a reason they became lazy. They didn't have to fight hard and work hard and become good teachers to attract students. Good students simply came to them because Oxford paid for them to come to them. This didn't stop Smith from studying. It also didn't stop him from receiving exactly the same funding from the British government that he criticized Oxford professors for getting. So he got a patronage fund from Lord Kames, and this led him to get his first job at the University of Edinburgh, where he taught philosophy. A lot of people don't know that Adam Smith was a philosopher before he got interested in political economy. And actually, one of his first books, and one that earns him fame, is A Theory of Moral Sentiments. So it's a work of moral philosophy, where he says that social morality is basically determined by people's ability to feel empathy. And he's arguing for a more empathetic society. And some people find this confusing because this line of reasoning is very different from what he's going to argue in The Wealth of Nations. Smith then takes a very unique step. He takes an innovative step for his career. So he has a professorship. It seems like the rest of his life is set. He has a stable job. He has a patronage from a lord. And what does he do? He gives up his professorship. He resigns because he gets a chance to tutor a duke and be his personal tutor, which gives him a unique opportunity that most people didn't have at the time, which is Smith gets to travel, all expenses paid, all around Europe and see the world and meet some of the most interesting people that existed at the time. So Europe was very different during Smith's life. To give you an understanding of how neither the French nor the American revolutions had happened, and the Industrial Revolution was only just beginning. So Europe was still a place which was ruled by kings and queens. Industry hadn't really developed to any great extent, so it was still mostly a place of farming and to a lesser extent trading. And the dominant thinking in Europe is what we call mercantilism, which is an economic theory that says the state has to control political power, and with control of political power, it can dominate economic power. So the state should do things like control trade routes and things like that in order to secure its success. Mercantilist argues it's necessary to control trade routes by force. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, the British Empire spent most of its money, militarily speaking, on having such a huge navy because it wanted to control the trade routes of the earth. So it does so to promote exports and win the economic war against other nations. So military power is a way of getting economic power, and by dominating militarily, you can dominate economically. Here's a quick summary of mercantilism, and we're going to compare this mercantilist theory with Smith's theory a little bit and think of what's the same and what's different. So mercantilism argues every part of a country's soil should be used productively in some way, either for agriculture, mining, or manufacturing. Secondly, mercantilism argues that raw materials should be used in domestic manufacturing because finished goods have higher value than raw materials. So the ultimate aim of getting raw materials is not just getting them and selling them. We want to get them, transform them into something expensive, and then sell them, because there's an argument that that's better than just selling the raw commodity by itself. Obviously, if you're going to do lots of transformative manufacturing, you need a large workforce. And mercantilism argues that having a large working population is a good thing. So population growth is not seen negatively at all. In a couple of weeks, we'll look at some theories that disagree with this and argue that population growth is necessarily a bad thing. Next, exports of gold and silver should be prohibited and domestic money should be kept in circulation. So this is an argument against a couple of things. Firstly, the circulation argument is an argument against saving. If people save money, the money is not being productively used. So mercantilists argue that we need to stop people from saving money as much as possible and make sure the money is circulating at all times. This is an economic argument that gets repeated in other economists in the 20th century, such as Keynes, where saving is seen as a negative thing and we actually need to use government power to encourage people to spend their money so that the economy is operating at maximum efficiency. Next, that we shouldn't export gold and silver because, we talked a little bit about the gold standard in class on Monday. Gold and silver were seen as special commodities that should be kept for a country's internal purposes only. Next, the imports of foreign goods should be discouraged. So obviously, if you think about the economy as a global contest where there's winners and losers, and if you think of winning as the extent to which I'm able to export things to other countries, exporting things is winning, importing things is losing. According to this logic, importing foreign goods should be discouraged because what we really want to do is encourage as much stuff to be produced locally as possible. We can see here that even though mercantilism is an old idea, a lot of aspects of this old idea still have currency today, where a lot of people argue for buying things locally, making things locally, producing things locally. In fact, some people might even argue that the Make in India campaign, for instance, is an example of mercantilist thinking. We were strongly encouraging domestic manufacturing for these types of reasons to win an economic contest. So when imports are absolutely required, mercantilists argue that it's a good idea to exchange them for domestically produced goods. So exchange them for domestically produced goods, not gold and silver, because again, gold and silver are like these special things that we reserve for very special purposes. Right, next, as much as possible, imports should be confined to raw materials that can be finished in the home country. If we look at this point in particular, we can understand much of the British relationship with India, at least economically, where India was seen as a place where raw materials, agricultural commodities, cotton, things like that can be taken in their raw form, where they can be turned into textiles and things in Britain. And then the finished commodities can then be exported to the rest of the world. Ensuring that Britain wins the economic war that way, ensuring that the colonial countries remain poor because they're only exporting the raw material, they're not doing the high quality manufacturing processes. So next, that the opportunities to be sought for selling a country's surplus manufacturers to foreigners for gold and silver. So in other words, if you want to sell something to another country, the best case scenario is where we can sell the things that we make and in exchange for it, get gold and silver for it. Because again, this is a time where gold and silver has the special status that can buy anything. It's seen as the most valuable thing, the universal commodity that we can use to buy whatever we want. All right, finally, no importation should be allowed if goods are sufficiently and suitably supplied at home. In other words, the emphasis is being placed on domestic manufacturing. If we have enough of something, the argument follows from mercantilism that we shouldn't import more of that thing from another country just because it wants to sell it to us. All right, so that's mercantilism in a very, very quick nutshell summary. Now, Smith is now going to meet the Physiocrats, who we sort of discussed in the previous video. He's touring France and he meets Francois Quesnay, who's the leading figure of the French Physiocrat school. And the Physiocrats were, at the time, critiquing mercantilism. The Physiocrats said that, well, why is France going through a kind of rough period? Well, it might be because they're wasting their money on expensive wars. They're doing what the mercantilists have asked them to do, trying to control the trade routes, trying to fight with Britain over naval supremacy, that kind of thing. The Physiocrats have then come up with this really interesting theoretical concept where we divide labor between productive and unproductive labor. And Smith's going to take that concept and introduce it into his later theories of political economy. So the argument from the Physiocrats is that too much of France's economy is involved in unproductive labor. Things like the nobility, things like the military, they don't produce anything. They just take value and consume it. Soldiers don't generally make anything. They just exist and spend money. They cost money to feed and clothe, and they cost money for ammunition and weapons and that sort of thing, but actually they don't make anything productive. So by having a huge military and a huge nobility, France is actually spending most of its resources on something that doesn't create anything. And the Physiocrats argue that's why France isn't doing so well economically. So what's their counter argument? Well, what was the one area of France's economy that was productive? And this is why they place so much emphasis on land. Agriculture was the one productive sector where they could talk about commodities being created, things that France could make the society richer with, things that they could export to other people. It's all coming from the land. So that led them to the conclusion that land was the source of all value. So Smith ends up finishing up his tutoring job, and he's on his way back to Scotland. He gets patronage, which allows him to sit at home and write his most famous work, the work that we're going to study, the full title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, so popularly known as The Wealth of Nations. It's one of the most influential books, probably of all time, at least in the last couple of hundred years, right? In terms of the way it influences not only academic discourse, but also government policy, especially in the British Empire. And because it influenced the British Empire, it influenced world history quite a lot, because the British were the most important empire at the time. So in this book, Smith is going to lay out his arguments on political economy. Here's a quick summary of the key concepts of Smith's political economy. So we've got the invisible hand. We've got the role of government in guaranteeing a free market. We've got the argument that nations become rich by reducing unproductive labor and increasing productive labor. So the relationship between these two is key in whether a country is successful economically or not. We have the argument for a division of labor, where work is divided up into pieces so that it can be more efficient as a process, that this promotes productivity and lowers prices. Interestingly, Smith has a labor theory of value, and we'll talk about what a labor theory of value means in a minute. And also, we have a theory of human motivations. So Smith has a specific understanding of what motivates human beings, not just economically, but in general, and what makes us human. How do we act and behave? And that's built into his theory of political economy. So to start with, the invisible hand is probably the best known of Smith's arguments. This is mostly because neoclassical economics retains this theory. Neoclassical economics, the modern economics profession, gets rid of a lot of things that Smith actually thought about, but keeps the invisible hand. And that's why we all know about it, I suppose. It's seen as the same as their principle of equilibrium. Smith's argument is basically that if individuals are allowed to freely pursue their self-interest, the result is that society will automatically benefit. If individuals can pursue their self-interest, society automatically benefits. That's the invisible hand, right? So the implication of this argument, if you believe in it, is that government should intervene as little as possible in the economy. Government should allow free markets and free trade as much as possible. Now, if we stop there and compare it to what we just looked at with the mercantilists, mercantilist arguments are all about government controlling the economy, dominating the trade routes, controlling production, controlling imports and exports, controlling all that sort of stuff. And suddenly, here's an argument that says, let's control as little as possible. Let's intervene as little as possible in the economy. At the time, quite a revolutionary argument. However, Smith is not arguing that government is worthless. And this is a lot of the way that he gets misinterpreted to be just a broad spectrum critique of government as a whole, right? For Smith, government has a number of important roles to perform. And this aspect of his work is often ignored because Smith, if you really put him in power in many governments today, he would argue for a massive increase in public spending. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. So Smith thinks that a government has a couple of responsibilities. One, it has to defend the territory of a nation. Two, it has to promote a system of justice, but also there are other areas where he thinks lots of public money should be spent. So looking at the role of government, he says that the first priority of government is to defend its sovereignty. The first duty of the sovereign, that of protecting the society from violence and invasion of other independent societies, can be performed only by means of a military force. So he's saying, well, maybe in general, I don't like government intervention into the economy, but we do need to intervene somewhat to get taxes to pay for the military. Even if I don't like the fact that it's unproductive, I do recognize that it needs to exist, because if we get conquered, there is no economy, and if there's no economy, there's no point about free trade, right? So the expense both of preparing the military force in the time of peace and of employing it in the time of war is very different in different states of society in different periods of improvement. He is warning us that if we spend more than we need to on the military, we're wasting our money and we're going to cause economic ruin in our society. And that every society is different. There can't be a uniform law about military spending. Secondly, policing is another role of government, according to Smith. He says the second duty of the sovereign is protecting as far as possible every member of society from injustice or oppression of every other member of it. Or the duty of establishing an exact administration of justice requires two different degrees of expense in different periods of society. In other words, we need to make sure people aren't just randomly robbing each other, randomly killing each other, and that sort of thing. We'll discuss this more when we discuss Smith's theory of human motivation. We'll see a little bit into his mind about how people behave and what type of policing might be necessary. Role number 3, I think we can broadly define it as unprofitable stuff. And this is the biggest role, actually, and in some ways the most controversial. So Smith says it's the third and last duty of the sovereign to erect and maintain public institutions and public works, which, though they might be highly advantageous to a great society, are such things that profit could never repay the expense to any small individual or number of small individuals. So therefore, like the simple way of saying this is that stuff that is great, but is not profitable, we can't expect an individual to contribute it. What are some examples of this? He's thinking about roads and infrastructure, right? If capitalists had to build their own roads, they'd never do it. Why would they never do it? Because it's just not profitable. They can't enforce the profit extraction necessary to justify the building of a road. And they don't want to spend all of their money building it, because then you encounter what's called the free rider problem, where all the other capitalists sit back while capitalist A builds the road, and then everybody else has used capitalist A road. So Smith's point is, who's the most rational person to do the spending in this case? Well, it must be government, because government is kind of this neutral position that's able to, build things that are good for the public interest as a whole, even when they're not profitable. So some other types of things that we're talking about then, mass education is another great example of something that is definitely not profitable, but it is certainly in the public interest. It's not in anybody's interest to have a dumb workforce, a workforce with low levels of skill. However, mass public education, it's really difficult to extract the right amount of money out of the population. And even if we do extract the amount of money, it's difficult to simultaneously provide quality education and extract the money from the population at the same time. You usually can do one or the other, but not both. So these are examples of what we call market failures, where a social need is there, and if that social need is met, it will make the nation more profitable. It will make the nation in a better situation. But private interests can't provide this social need, and if it attempts to do so, weird stuff starts to happen. What's another good example? We can look at the health industry. Now, when we think of the health industry, when we think of doctors and hospitals and stuff like that, and I ask you, well, what's the purpose of a doctor? What's the purpose of a hospital? Most of you probably answer, it's to heal us. It's to make us better. It's to treat illnesses. It's to make sure that we recover. The truth about the healthcare industry, though, is that if everybody recovered, if nobody was ever sick, no money could be made out of the industry. Actually, the industry does its best in share market terms in times like right now, during the coronavirus crisis. Well, guess who's going to make the most money out of the fact of this crisis? Companies that are working in the health sector, companies that produce things like vaccines, companies that produce things like antiretroviral drugs or PPE equipment or stuff like that. So the sicker we get, the more money is made. And that seems like a pretty weird outcome for an industry that's supposed to promote our health and well-being. So Smith didn't mention healthcare directly, but there's substantial evidence that he would support a universal public health system, simply because of this market failure that exists with the health system itself. So what did Smith think about stuff like, well, the capitalists as a social group? And it's interesting that somebody who supports free markets and free trades actually had a fairly negative perspective on capitalists themselves and their behavior. In particular, he didn't like the fact that capitalists love collaborating with government. He said that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation always ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So basically, leave a bunch of capitalists in the room, especially if you leave them in a room with some government decision makers. Smith believes they're going to conspire to extort money out of the public. Smith's entire theory of political economy is based on individual interest and individual competition. So he's really scared that business is going to be allowed to form monopolies and that government can be allowed to support business interests. And we might want to think really hard about, well, to what extent does government support business interests today? Is there a close cooperation between big monopoly corporations and government activity? Is that something we can see in the world around us? So Smith may be telling us something. Is he maybe right about this? We'll see throughout the semester that there's a bunch of other theorists who are interested in this idea of monopoly. Why does monopoly form? When does it form? Under what conditions it forms? Is it natural? Is it good? Is it bad? What should we think about monopoly? However, Smith definitely thought monopoly was a bad thing, and he supported regulation that promotes competition. Obviously his whole theory of the invisible hand won't work if there are these big giant, interests working together. The whole theory of the invisible hand is based on little tiny individual interests working for a greater common good. So the next topic that Smith was interested in is this distinction between productive and unproductive labor. I want you to really think about what this distinction means in the society that you're from. So in this case, like if you're from India, you want to think about, well, what labor around me can I see that's productive? And what labor around me can I see that's unproductive? Okay, let's hear what Smith has to say. There's one sort of labor that adds to the value of the subject upon which it is bestowed, and there's another which has no such effect. So the former, as it produces a value, may be called productive, the latter, unproductive labor. And in particular, he provides a concrete example, and he says, the labor of a manufacturer adds generally to the value of materials which he works upon, that of his own maintenance and of his master's profit. The labor of a menial servant, on the contrary, adds to the value of nothing. Though the manufacturer has his wages advanced to him by his master, he in reality costs him no expense. The value of those wages being generally restored, together with a profit, in the improved value of the subject upon which his labor is bestowed, which is really just a fancy way of saying, if you employ a worker and that worker works on a manufacturing process, even though we pay them some wages, we're generally going to make way more money than what we pay them in wages. And we'll see that this subject gets picked up by the Marxists later on when we study them. The entire concept of surplus value is based on the idea that workers contribute a lot more value than the wages that they get paid. And Smith tends to agree. So on the other hand, he will argue that the maintenance of a menial servant is never restored. A man grows rich by employing a multitude of manufacturers. He grows poor by maintaining a multitude of menial servants. Right? So here we can see Smith is borrowing somewhat from the French Physiocrats school. And he's saying that, well, I mean, the French Physiocrats said that people grow rich by having lots of land and making sure we spend most of our efforts productively. Okay, Smith modifies it a little bit and says, well, maybe not just land, maybe having lots of manufacturers is good too, because he thought about things in industrial terms. But where he agreed with the Physiocrats is to say we grow poor as a society by having lots of people involved in unproductive labor, whether it's servants or any other type of unproductive labor. So there we have this discussion, which is going to be about productive labor, productivity, and the population as a whole. And Smith says the annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and convenience of life it annually consumes. Right, so where do we get all the stuff we need? Well, it's from all the people who actually do the work, ideally. This produce is greater or smaller to the number of people who consume it. But the proportion must in every nation be regulated by two different circumstances. Right, so there's two things that determine how much we get out of the population who is in the workforce. Firstly, skill, dexterity, and judgment. A highly educated, highly skilled workforce is going to produce more and better stuff than a workforce that is badly educated and not skilled. That's one of the reasons Smith supported the idea of public education. And secondly, the proportion between the number of those who are employed in useful labor and that of those who are not so employed. So the relationship between productive labor as a percentage of the workforce and unproductive labor. The more productive workers you've got, the richer the society will be. We can think of having a largely unproductive workforce as a kind of like a parasite society, I guess, where there's people who aren't really producing anything to the social good are actually just removing from the social good and causing economic collapse, I guess. So Smith moves on then to discuss a labor theory of value. And from the previous quote, we can see that Smith believes in a labor theory of value. He believes that value is the source of labor, right? So value is created by labor, but only under certain circumstances. Value is created by labor in a process of manufacturing, not in the process of menial servitude. So Smith is differentiating between productive and unproductive labor, labor that creates goods, labor that does not. And if, according to him, if you want to become a society that develops fast, you need to be the type of society that produces goods, the productive society, as much as possible. From this, we can see a key difference between Smith's views on development and the modern economics understanding on development. Smith would say, well, if we look at a thing like GDP, for example, which measures the total amount of value produced in an economy, he would say, actually, that's not the most important thing. The composition of our economy, the distinction between how much of our economy is productive and how much of it is on unproductive sectors, that's the most important thing if we want to grow. It's okay to have a smaller GDP as long as a greater percentage of that GDP is involved in the production of goods. That's what's going to make our society richer over time. So then the question comes up, well, can we have a 100% productive workforce? And then, we can object and say that some unproductive labor is probably necessary for any society to function. You can look at occupations like cleaning or record keeping, teaching or repairs, waste management, things like that. These are all useful things that we can't completely do without them. Smith's point is basically that as we can't do without these things, it's kind of like sleep. We can, if only we didn't have to sleep, how much more work we could do, how much more fun we could have, all that sort of thing. But we obviously know if we don't sleep, we're going to die, or at least become much less efficient. So what should we do with our sleep? Well, we should do it as efficiently as possible. We should structure our society, when it comes to unproductive labor, we should structure our society in such a way to avoid waste and minimize unproductive labor to the greatest extent possible. We need to focus on efficiency in this respect. So it can be quite interesting, therefore, to speculate what would Smith think about some of the modern industries that have evolved, that were very, very small things back in his day, but they're very, very big things right now. So the modern finance sector or insurance or advertising, these are all generally unproductive industries. They don't produce goods. They certainly take up a large percentage of our economy. What would Smith potentially have to say about those? So Smith also believes that eventually labor is going to lead to abundance. And importantly, it's not just going to make rich people rich, it's going to make poor people rich too. He says that the great multiplication of the production of all the different arts in consequence of the division of labor, which, if a well-governed society exists, universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of people. So everybody is going to be rich as long as we follow his glorious advice. Every workman is going to have a great quantity of his own work to dispose beyond what he himself has occasion for. So everybody's going to be able to work as much as they like, and everybody's going to get paid well for it, and there's going to be abundance of goods, and everybody's going to live happily kind of ever after. Okay. So Smith likes the division of labor. He thinks it's the road to future prosperity. And I guess we're going to see in a minute why this is kind of a controversial thing, because he also doesn't like the division of labor, and that's the confusing part, I suppose. So Smith has a very confusing view on the division of labor. On the one hand, he thinks it's really important for industrial progress. The very start of the Wealth of Nations, when you read it, it will say the division of labor results in improvements to productivity. And he has an example of a pin factory that makes pins, and he tries to argue that if we split the making of pins up into little different tasks and get people to do different parts of different tasks instead of a single person making a whole pin, the result is we're going to be able to make much more pins than if we had done it the other way, right? However, and this is the other point that people tend to ignore, Smith warns us that the division of labor has some negative consequences. It has the potential, in particular, to reduce our mental capacity. So he says, the man whose life is spent performing a very few simple operations, of which the effects are perhaps always the same or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding or exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur, which is a complicated way of saying if you do simple repetitive tasks, you don't learn anything. And he naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally becomes, I've underlined it for effect, as stupid and ignorant as it's possible for a human creature to become. And the torpor of his mind renders him not only incapable of relishing or bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life. So in this sentence, Smith is saying the division of labor is a problem, not just from an economic standpoint. It doesn't just make us less capable workers, it makes us less capable citizens. We're less rational people, less capable of empathy, less capable of forming sentiments, less capable of participating in public life. And then in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is the great body of people, must necessarily fall unless government takes some pains to prevent it. So he ends this section by saying, yes, the division of labor is bad. Yes, it's going to make us stupid. Yes, it's going to make us dull. Yes, it's going to have all these negative effects. But I can justify it by saying, but productivity is better if we do it. And then I can justify it further by saying, well, now that I've made everybody stupid, it's the government's responsibility to pick them up off the floor and make them smart again, to mitigate the worst effects of the division of labor. So some of the negative aspects of the division of labor, Smith is probably one of the more honest people about this subject. There are a lot of 20th century theorists whose position is kind of like the division of labor is great, it's the best thing ever, there are no negative side effects, let's just do it. They retain the belief that Smith has that the division of labor leads to increased profitability. But they reject the other belief that he expressed, which is that it has some negative side effects. So Smith, on the other hand, says, on the one hand, we've got some benefits, productivity. On the other, we've got some costs. Firstly, human misery. Doing a repetitive task all day sucks. You wouldn't want to do it. I don't want to do it. The people who do it don't want to do it, right? Nobody wants to do it, especially because it creates human stupidity, right? If you're doing a task, if you're stuck doing a task all day that's simple and repetitive, the net result is you're not being challenged. And the net result of that is not only the physical exertion where your body wears out, but the lack of being challenged mentally stunts the growth of your intellectual development. So government, according to Smith, needs to play some kind of role to limit this human cost. And there's this debate about the division of labor is pretty important in political economy. We'll see that most of the theorists that we'll study in some way have some view about the extent to which the division of labor is a good idea or not. Is it a good idea at all, or what should the government do about it? How do we mitigate the worst effects of it? That sort of thing. So Smith also has a theory of human motivation, and it's important to understand the relationship between his theory of human motivation and the way he thinks society should be structured in economic terms. So here he says, men may live together in society with some tolerable degree of security, though there is no civil magistrate to protect them from the injustice of those passions. So we could coexist without the law, without judges, without police, and that sort of thing. And we'd probably be fine at a certain level of development. But avarice and ambition in the rich and in the poor, the hatred of labor and the love of present ease and enjoyment, these are the passions which prompt us to invade property. Passions more steady in their operation, more universal in their influence. Smith is saying the reason that we have the state, the reason we have the police and the law and all that sort of thing, is it's the only thing that prevents us from taking other people's property. And he makes it even more clear by saying, wherever there's great property, there is great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. So richness creates poverty. In this respect, for a theorist who strongly supports capitalism, Smith is quite honest about how the capitalist system operates. He's saying there is a direct relationship between some being rich and some being poor. And Smith's theory suggests that government comes about partly as the result of this concentration of ownership. And this makes him very similar to a Marxist argument about why government exists, that the state exists to resolve class conflict, to rule in the interests of a specific class or group of classes. That's the standard Marxist argument about why the government exists at all. And it's Smith's argument too. So civil government, so far as it's instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or for those who have some property against those who have none at all. Here Smith is clearly arguing the reason that we have government is to protect rich people's stuff and stop the poor people from taking it away. Can't get more naked than that. So Smith then moves on to talk about this idea of unequal bargaining power, which shows that he's really aware that depending on what social class you're from, your life experience is likely to be very different. So he says a landlord, a farmer, a master manufacturer, and a merchant, though they did not employ a single workman, could generally live a year or two upon their stocks, which they've already acquired. So living on their savings, basically. But many workmen could not subsist a week, few could not subsist a month, and scarce any a year without employment. In the long run, the workman may be as necessary to the master as the master is to him, but the necessity is not so immediate. So in other words, he's talking here that if the capitalist stops investing, he can probably live for the rest of his life, or he's being less ambitious. He'd live for some time, just on the savings. Most working people can't just live on their savings. They have a very limited time where they can go without being employed in some way. And what this creates is a huge power imbalance, where workers realize that they're in a weak bargaining position. They can't ask for more money very easily, or they can't ask for better working conditions very easily, because if they do, they know that they're if they somehow lose their job, they've got like a very short period to find another job again before they start to face physical consequences. So Smith makes this observation, but it's a little sad that he doesn't really draw any implications from this observation and apply it to his theory. It's just one of those times where he just intellectually notices something. He says, oh, look at that. The workers and the capitalists have different bargaining power. Yeah, cool. Moving on. I guess that's what we have to do right now too. We're going to move on because Smith didn't have that much to say about it. So if we take Smith's theory as a whole, right, and we look at the policy implications, here we're asking the question, if he was alive today, what would he suggest that governments all around the world should do? Well, suggestion number one, we should reduce speculative and unproductive activity. We should stop people gambling the money, and that includes gambling on investment, gambling on the stock market, gambling on stuff like that, just as much as it includes gambling itself, and reduce unproductive activity. It's no surprise that very soon after Smith published The Wealth of Nations, the British government introduces taxes on hiring servants. So the more servants you hire, the more tax you pay, clearly trying to discourage people from wasting money on servants. clearly trying to push people out of servitude and into the manufacturing sector so that they're producing goods. They also introduced taxes on auction properties to curb speculation in housing and real estate. They wanted people to invest their money productively, not gamble on the fact that land or houses were going to improve in prices and we're just going to gamble on that price increase. They want all the money to invest productively. Next, Smith would suggest that we reduce government involvement to just a few things: providing security and the provision of unprofitable public institutions. So as a liberal theorist, Smith does not believe it's government's job to do things like setting social morality, providing welfare, providing employment, planning economic development, or running enterprises. But he does believe it's government's job to do things like providing public education, providing good quality roads and transport, and any other thing that's of public good that could not be done profitably by private sector interests. Number 3, promote free markets. So Smith believes strongly that prices should be allowed to change according to whatever the market dictates. So supply and demand is not only a rule for how prices are determined, he thinks it should be the rule for how prices are determined. And it doesn't matter what type of commodity we're talking about. Now, some people feel uncomfortable with this. For example, a lot of people object, well, what about essential goods? What about things like food or medicine or stuff like that? If we let the prices of these goods just go up and down, that costs people's lives, right? That causes people to die prematurely. That causes malnourishment. That causes some seriously bad consequences, right? On the other hand, what if certain prices run too low? Like what if certain agricultural commodities become worthless, for example, one year, and all the farmers go bankrupt, and then they're no longer there the next year? They're disappeared. Well, that can cause a food security crisis, right? Smith says in the long run, I believe in this concept of equilibrium, so I'm pretty sure crisis is never going to happen. So therefore, in the short run, let market prices go up and down. In the long run, everything will be fine. He's asking us to trust him on this. There are various theorists we'll study this semester who have a really big problem with the political and economic instability which is caused by rising and falling prices. And says that this is one of the key points of instability in the capitalist system, that the economy is such an unstable thing because the prices of things go up and down, and we can't just allow the prices of things to go up and down because those things affect people's lives. Next, Smith would argue in favor of free trade. He thinks there's no negative consequences of free trade and therefore no justification for government to either direct or support the economy. His argument on new businesses is that either they work by themselves or they should go out of business. The government shouldn't be helping business to succeed in any way, even if it's a small industry just getting started. So he's an aggressive promoter of free trade. And this is one of the things that modern economics keeps from Smith's theory, the argument strongly for free markets and free trade. Next week, next class, we're going to look at David Ricardo, who also argued a lot about free trade and the importance of free trade as being part of a functioning capitalist system. Next, he would argue we need to reduce unproductive activity. Smith has a real problem with unproductive activity. He hates waste, he hates wasteful consumption, and he hates speculation. His argument is that nations become rich when they maximize production. And if we're not maximizing production, we're just wasting our value. In other words, he'd want us to look heavily at our economy and say, well, to what extent could we minimize some of this unproductive activity? Do we really need all those servants? Do we really need all those people in finance? Do we really need such a big military? Do we really need all those people in advertising? Do we need all that stuff? Can we cut back on those things? Maybe it is the government's job to encourage people to cut back on those things so that most of the value is being invested productively. Next, Smith argues that it is the government's job to provide things that are useful but not profitable. Government has a big role, and this is one area where people get Smith completely wrong. I think he's the guy who's about to theorize that government has no job to do. Government should step out the way and do nothing, and the markets are going to take care of everything. He is definitely not making this argument at all. There are a wide range of things that aren't profitable, but are definitely necessary to make a nation a better place. And today we've discussed the examples of infrastructure, health, and education as being things that make a nation more productive. Smith is therefore very different from neoclassical economics theorists who support the privatization of almost everything. He strongly believes in government ownership of unprofitable things. So in terms of the wealth of nations, I mean, how do we assess Adam Smith and how do we assess his legacy in terms of our understanding of the economy? The wealth of nations certainly changed the way a lot of people thought about political economy. It began this big debate with the mercantilists who believed that wealth was equal to gold and silver, and that countries should do things like limit imports and maximize exports to maximize their wealth. I'm not saying Smith killed the mercantilists. A lot of people still believe in that. And the longer we study, we'll discover that there's a group of people called neo-mercantilists or new mercantilists who are resurrecting and reviving this mercantilist theory. Just because it's gone out of fashion doesn't mean it's a dead idea. There's lots in mercantilism that people believe, and sometimes for good reasons. We'll get into that later this semester. But against the mercantilists, Smith argued that wealth is actually goods, okay? And in this way, he's definitely advanced our understanding of the economy above what it was. Smith's argument is more or less that we turn gold and silver into a bit of a fetish. It's a commodity that can't really do many things, but it's shiny and glittery and we like the look of it and stuff. And so we think it's way more valuable than it actually is. And for Smith, well, actually it's not gold that's valuable. It's things that we can use as valuable. Stuff that we make productively is valuable. Shirts that we wear or commodities that we use or cars or clothes. I mean, in the modern day, you probably say, look at the difference between gold and a smartphone. What's the better commodity? Clearly the smartphone's a better commodity. You can do so much more with it. But I'd be interested to actually compare smartphones and gold per kilogram, which one is more valuable according to market prices today. So as a result of this specialization and division of labor, Smith suggests that it's possible for a nation to accumulate capital and develop its productive potential. So every country has to think really seriously about what things it should specialize in, how to create a division of labor, and how to produce things efficiently. But on the other hand, he warned against the stupefying effects of the division of labor. So Smith was really worried about the fact that the division of labor might make us richer, but it's going to make us dumber, less valuable citizens. And he really was warning government that there are social problems that can emerge because of this. And the government's job is to do something about the social problems that emerge because of the division of labor. That means doing anything, promoting some sort of unprofitable activity again that would make people more intelligent or happier or that sort of thing. He was also really worried about the social tensions caused by inequality of wealth. Smith acknowledges inequality is a problem. He says that most of the problems in our justice system result from inequality, and that therefore that's something government should be thinking about in a serious way. Now, he stops short of saying, therefore, we should redistribute money from the rich to the poor, right? He's not a Marxist, he's not a social democrat, he's not arguing for redistribution necessarily, but he does think government has a role to play in doing something about this inequality problem. He just doesn't say exactly what. So finally, Smith argued that capital accumulation depends on security of property, and therefore he gives a lot of importance to military, defense, and policing. Now, he's not arguing, let's go nuts with the military. He learned from the French Physiocrats school that if you spend too much money on the military, eventually you head for an economic collapse. But you do have to spend just enough to make sure you can maintain your existing position or perhaps slightly improve your existing position. That's the level of military spending he's looking for, but only that much. Okay, so that's the implications of Smith's theory. I hope you've enjoyed this brief summary to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and I hope that that's furthered your understanding of what I think is a very important political economist, and we'll look forward to discussing more about Adam Smith in some subsequent classes. Thanks, everyone.